Welcome to the Thresholds of Reality, the podcast where we explore unexplained and mysterious events, phenomena, and legends. Today we are talking to notable filmmaker and moon landing skeptic Bart Sibrel, and he's going to convince you all. I'm already convinced, but he's going to convince you all that the moon landing was faked. So while we have that happen, strap in as we explore the edges of the unknown. Bart, thank you so much for joining us. I mentioned before the show, it's not every day we get to talk to somebody who's been punched by an astronaut. And
Yeah, I mean, it's either me or his family members.
wow, so no love lost for Buzz Aldrin. That's what
No, actually, I do love the guy.
Okay.
I love him a lot.
All right. So we want to start with how it was that you felt. In previous interviews, it seems like this is kind of something you feel impelled to do, not that you have to kind of expose this deception. And how was it that impulsion got a hold of you?
Well, I grew up as the biggest fan of the moon missions. In fact, I was probably the only person who had 20 pictures of Apollo 11 on the bedroom wall for the age of 4 to 14. I was 4 when the missions took place, and my father was in the Air Force, and he gave me a VIP package of 9 by 12 color prints from Apollo 11, and they were my cherished present, and I thought they were great. And so I saw them 3,650 times before I even considered the possibility that the moon missions were faked. Which happened because I saw a TV program with a former NASA contractor of 6 years during the Apollo program, William Casey, who said he had high security clearance, and he read a memo from von Braun saying the odds of going to the moon and not killing the crew on the first attempt with 1960s untried technology was about 1 in 10,000, and that the scheme was initiated to bluff, like when you have crap in poker, to pretend like you're doing better than you really are. And that kind of planted the seed in my mind. And I looked at those pictures on my bedroom wall. And sure enough, it was like my eyes were wide shut. I noticed that you could see a pretty clear distinction between the soil and the backdrops. In fact, in the early pictures, the soil was a caramel brown and the background landscapes were grayish blue. They've since corrected those, but if you can get a book from the library or on eBay that was published in 69, 70, 71 of the moon pictures, they show, like the Chinese probe, the actual surface of the moon is brown. It only appears gray because of the sunlight on it. And 10 years forward into the future, at 24, I'd become a filmmaker. And as God would have it, I'm editing a film one day for the man who produced the show I saw 10 years earlier as a 14-year-old, with the guy on it who said he worked for NASA and they didn't go to the moon. So I'm like, hey, what was that guy's name? He put me in touch with him. And being a filmmaker, this gentleman suggested that I make a movie about it. So rather than saying yes right away, I kind of looked into it first. In fact, spent almost a full-time job for 6 months figuring out a lot of odd things about it, like shadows that are supposed to run parallel in sunlight intersect at 90 degrees from objects 5 feet apart in some of the moon pictures, the strange behavior of the first crew, 2 of the 3 of which rarely gave interviews, the administrator of NASA resigning mysteriously days before the first mission, and all these things made me suspicious that, yeah, maybe they did fake it. So originally I turned down the project. I said, look, I'm not going to risk my life for what Nixon did. And then another 5 years go by, and I had another client as a filmmaker who was a famous Christian musician, and they said they would get one of my screenplays to a Hollywood producer if I did a favor for them. I'm like, well, what? They said, read the Bible. I really considered reading kind of a boring thing to do. And I had a Bible, like a dictionary encyclopedia for reference as a writer. But I said, okay. So I got a 1 year Bible, which divided the Bible into 365 daily reads of about 15 minutes each. And after reading it over the next 5 years, 5 times from cover to cover, I wasn't a Christian by any means. However, I did develop an understanding of there is right and wrong, there is good and evil, there are lies and truth, and there likely is an accountability after this life for how we lived. And all that to answer your question, which is I realized that if they faked the moon landing, that's actually more profound of an event historically than if they'd actually gone. I mean, those are the two choices. Either they were able to plant a flag on a rock, or they set a goal to do it. They lied about it. They murdered people, embezzled money, lied to the encyclopedia, held ticker tape parades for guys, and gave them medals of honor for lying. That event, if true, the faking of the moon missions, is more profound historically than if they'd actually gone. And I realized this could be true. And if so, mankind needs to know about it. So I changed my mind. I realized I'm going to die anyway, so I might as well die for a just cause, or you could say go out in a blaze of glory. I called back up a bill casing and got financing. Believe it or not, there's a gentleman I met who's a board member for an aerospace company that builds rockets for NASA, who knows that the moon missions are fake. He gave me $1 million to produce these films as his patriotic duty. And then I had my film open up, seeing how I'd kind of started reading the Bible with the Tower of Babel, which the Bible says was only built to boast to the neighboring nation. Look, we can build a building taller than you, right? It was never finished. And then we showed the Titanic, which was the largest machine ever built by humans. And they said in publicity, it's the ship that God Himself could not sink. Never made one voyage. Tower of Babel never finished. And then Richard Nixon, when he knew they were not on the moon, had the audacity to say putting a man on the moon was the greatest event since creation. It's really a blasphemous thing that mankind's greatest event is a complete fraud that they said was second only to God making the universe. So I sense this spiritual message here in the faking of the moon landing. And it literally is a false God, because I talked to a professor at a major university. He's the professor of aerospace. And I showed him all this proof, shadows intersecting, which one picture will prove that we didn't go to the moon. I can show it to you later in a screen share. Then we found classified footage of fake photography, that they're faking part of the photography right in front of your eyes with a third track of audio of the CIA telling them how to do it. I can show that later. Then we have the logic that they can't go 1,000 times farther into space in 1969 than they can today. That means technology is going backwards. That doesn't make any sense. And then we also have, I mean, any of these four proofs would prove it. We have a deathbed confession of a man who was there at the time at a military base that I released in my book, Moon Man, at Sibrel.com, who says, I witnessed the faking of it. And yet the professor said there's nothing I could say that will convince him that his sacred cow, the moon landings, was false. And I said, okay, well, what about this one? What if you saw Buzz Aldrin on national TV crying and confessing, I'm sorry, we faked the moon landings? And then he said, I still think we went. And I'm like, oh my goodness. So this event, it's so bizarre because people really get mad at you for just saying the government lied on one occasion. It really is sacred to these people. And we know we have a corrupt federal government. We know their own government killed Kennedy, did 9/11, did this little thing they've been doing for 2 years. And even though the moon landing may have, the fraud of it killed fewer people, if the truth comes out, it's going to outrage Americans more than any other fraud because it's so burned in their psyche. So There's your 10-minute answer to your one sentence question.
No, that is fantastic. So, uh, as I was going through the movie, I did catch up a lot of the. I watched a funny thing happen on the way to the moon, and I did catch a lot of those religious messages right at the beginning. The idea of there not being enough government accountability or these monuments to man's hubris. You know, the Tower of Babel, uh, the the Titan, the unsinkable Titanic, and then now, of course, the Moon Apollo program, where they're saying they're going to the moon several times, and it's the greatest thing ever. Um, but probably the thing that really strikes me the most from the film is the idea that the Van Allen belts, right? There's these very strong um, belts of radiation around the Earth at about 200 to 1,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface, right? And that if an individual or person passed through that belt without sufficient protection, they'd be irradiated to death.
Well,
Right.
that's true. And that's not my opinion. It's the opinion of NASA engineer Kelly Smith, who actually is an engineer for the Orion Artemis project that is supposed to be launching in a few days. They're sending an unmanned spacecraft through the radiation belt. Now, Moon Man, my book, which for the first time ever discloses the actual name of the military base where Apollo 11 was filmed, the dates it was filmed, the official CIA code name for the real Apollo project, and the list of 15 people who were eyewitnesses given to me by the chief of security military police officer of that base on his deathbed. So in the book, it's 12 chapters, but there's 15 video links. So I write a chapter, I say, stop, go to Sibrel.com, watch this link so you know what I'm about to talk about next. Well, one of the links is Kelly Smith doing a video promoting the Orion Artemis project, saying that this field of radiation that you spoke of, Sam, is dangerous and that the technology necessary for an astronaut to pass through it and not be killed has yet to be invented. So, seeing how they had to go through it to reach the moon, and the technology to survive doing so hasn't been invented, that means they didn't go to the moon. He just said so right there. And so I call up NASA and say, hey, let me talk to this guy. They say, well, we don't give interviews anymore. And I'm like, okay, well, you sent an unmanned probe in 2014 into these radiation belts with 2 Geiger counters. Can I please have these Geiger counter readings? And they said, no, it's a military secret. And I'm like, really? I mean, you sent a probe to the sun to find out how much hydrogen is in the atmosphere. The amount of hydrogen in the sun's atmosphere isn't a military secret. And when you sent a probe to Jupiter to find out how much helium is in Jupiter's atmosphere, the amount of helium in Jupiter's atmosphere, that's not a military secret, it's just nature. So why would the amount of radiation surrounding the Earth, which is just nature, like the temperature outside, why would that be a military secret? But it is, because if they released how deadly the radiation is, it would prove beyond a doubt that no one could go through it and survive. And that's why in a few days, they're sending an unmanned probe through the radiation belt. Now, here's something interesting. In 1960s, all of NASA combined, when they launched allegedly to go to the moon, every computer combined had 1/1,000,000th the computing power of a cell phone. And with that backwards technology, before cell phones, before microwave ovens, they went from never having a man in space to walking on the moon in 8 years. Now, here we are with 5 decades better technology, and it took 18 years, more than twice the time, with 5 decades better technology, just to send an unmanned probe to orbit the moon and not land. How can that be? How can they have better technology that's faster, more efficient in 1969 that can travel 1,000 times farther into space than NASA can send astronauts today? How can they have better technology 50 years ago than today? Well, they can't. That's impossible. It's amazing how crystal clear it is that they didn't go to the moon, and people just refuse to see it because it's a god to them.
My thing is, why did they stop then? If they really went to the moon, why would we stop going there? Don't you think with the technology nowadays, we would have some kind of structure there now for us to go back and forth, and because we have this technology now, but why would they just stop if they did go?
Yeah. Well, Kyle, it's kind of like thinking about the South Pole. The South Pole is here on Earth, right? It took like 6 times before they made it to the South Pole. The first 5 crews dropped dead trying. Isn't that interesting? They can't even get to the South Pole here on Earth on the first, second, third, fourth, or fifth try. And then when they get there, yeah, it's 100-mile-per-hour winds, and yeah, it's 100 degrees below zero. But right now, their base is there. Why? Because it's humanly possible. If it were humanly possible to go to the moon on the first attempt with 1960s technology, there'd be bases all over the moon from multiple countries. In fact, we should have been on Mars 10 years later and in another solar system by now. I mean, just 10 years after the first atomic bomb exploded, 10 years later, atomic bombs were 1,000 times more powerful. So imagine how far we should be into space with astronauts if we went to the moon on the first attempt, you know? And another thing is actually in the entire history of aviation, there's never been a single flying machine designed that got off the ground on the first attempt. With 10 years better technology than the Apollo equipment, they made the 747 aircraft, and that was after millions of aircraft had been built and flown. And it took 168 attempts to get that fuselage off the ground. So, how can the most complicated aerospace endeavor of all time work on the first attempt when the simplest one, the Wright brothers, didn't work on the first attempt? Hmm.
Yeah, I 100% agree. This Nothing works on the first attempt. Rarely,
No. Yeah,
but for the most
and
part,
I mean, it's like saying they did cold fusion, on the 50 years ago on the first try, and well, they lost the technology. They can't find it again. Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and one of the main things, one of the first arguments that arises in your movie is the lighting. So the question then is like, okay, so they didn't go to the moon. How were they able to fake it? And so you talk a lot about the lighting setup and the sound stage, and maybe you could go into a little bit more about the how now.
Well, yeah, it's interesting that some people claim that it's easier to go to the moon than to fake it. I mean, that's just the exact opposite of logic and the truth. There
Right.
was a film came out recently called The Martian. Did they film on location in Mars, or did they create a television studio? It's a lot easier to fake something than to actually do it. And so I lay out in the book the actual military base here in the United States, where it was filmed, go into detail about how it was filmed. And one of the people on the list of 15 eyewitnesses who were allowed in to observe was a guy I never heard of. I looked him up, and he was a science fiction writer and filmmaker. So I guess he was there to kind of give critiques on whether it looked real or not. And that's how they did it. It was actually pretty simple. People were convinced that they were on the moon from a simple black and white fuzzy television image of such low quality it could have been shot in someone's backyard at night with a spotlight, and it would have looked about the same. In fact, they deliberately degraded the quality of the image. The networks complained, how come we can't have a live feed? So what they did is they took the feed from the moon, they projected it on this huge screen with 1969 video projection technology. They had a television camera film that. That went to a monitor, and then they had a television camera film the monitor, and that was what people saw. They were intentionally degrading the image by 4 generations. So when Ron Howard, whose own grandfather warned him that the moon missions were fake, and he didn't listen, he wanted to do this big, what do you call it? That big screen, IMAX screen, showing the moon missions. And he said, "Hey, NASA, give me all of this footage. I'm going to transfer it to HD." They said, "Give us a couple of days." And within those 2 days, they misplaced 2 tons of original videotapes. That's when the tapes went missing, because Ron Howard was about to transfer them to HD and project them at 120 feet by, 100 feet at this high resolution than had ever been seen before. And if you watch that film that he made, 95% of it are reenactments, because there's so little footage of them actually on the moon. And some of them are reduced to about 5% of the IMAX screen size because it came from VHS. He had to rent it from Blockbuster. You can see the VHS tracking lines at the bottom of the picture. That's all they had available. Now, if you really went to the moon, why would you destroy all the documentation? Because that's what they admit. One of the clips, which you can see for free at Sibrel.com, just the top left button says Moonman Book Links, is their own NASA astronaut, Don Pettit, saying they deliberately destroyed the technology that they built and spent $200 billion in today's dollars to go to the moon. Now, my father, one of the things that he did in the Air Force is he flew on a B-52 bomber. The B-52 bomber is now more than 70 years old, and there's 200 of them still in service. How about that? Because nothing works better. If they were going to destroy a technology, maybe they should have destroyed the blueprints of the atomic bomb after they won World War II, right? But did they do that? No. They would not throw away that precious investment, would they? Why would someone spend $200 billion developing the technology to go to the moon, and when they're done, they scrap the hardware, they deliberately throw away, destroy the blueprints, the electronic schematics, the telemetry data of where the spacecraft really was, and all the original videotapes? I mean, that itself speaks of a fraud. I mean, if Oswald killed Kennedy, then the Kennedy assassination file would have been opened in 1963. The fact that they're continually delaying them is only proof that they're not telling us the truth. And if they really went to the moon, they would never destroy a $200 billion investment. If they perpetrated a fraud, they would destroy everything, which is exactly what they did, which is actually proof of the fraud.
Yeah, it's so funny you bring that up, because the nuclear bombs, the 3 original nuclear bombs, 2 of them were set off, but a third one was not set off, and they actually extracted that plutonium core and continued to study it for many years, and it gained the notoriety Demon Core. And this is highly radioactive material that they saved, versus the Apollo mission space shuttle, which was destroyed. So it just lends all the credibility to that argument. Yeah.
I can't even wrap my head around it because it just doesn't make sense.
I know. Nothing about it makes sense. I mean, it doesn't make sense that a moon rover would cost about $100 million in today's currency, even though it has about 1/4 the parts that a Jeep does, right? It's just an electric car. They made electric golf carts, 20 years earlier.
Right.
How big of a deal can it be? They're just milking the taxpayer and sending that money to some squirrely projects that they don't want to tell us about.
Mm-hmm. I don't understand it. So if you get into the pictures a little bit, you can see different shadowings. Shouldn't all of them be coming one direction?
Yeah, I could do a screen share here.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and hit share screen. Share screen. I'll share this one, and I'll open up this picture here. Here is a picture I took out in sunlight, and the sun is 93 million miles away. It's about 1 million times bigger in volume than the Earth. So it's going to cast shadows in the same direction over the entire continent or the moon. These are 2 telephone poles about 5 feet apart, and you'll see it's mathematically, scientifically impossible for shadows to intersect if they're in sunlight. Now, here's a picture from what they claim was the last trip to the moon, Apollo 17, the astronaut shadow is going at 12 o'clock, and the rock here about 5 feet away is going at 9 o'clock. 90-degree difference from objects 5 feet apart. Now, take it from a filmmaker whose job for the last 35 years has been to make fake scenes look real. This is electrical lighting. This is all the proof that you need that the moon missions were fake, because they claim these were taken in sunlight. Sunlight does not intersect shadows at 90 degrees, which means it's electrical light, which means they're on Earth, which means they didn't go to the moon. This is all the proof that you need.
Because that means they had electrical lights in multiple locations.
Well, yeah, they either had more than one light, which is likely the case, or sometimes one light that's so close, if you're to the left of it, it's going to cast a shadow in one direction. If you're to the right of the light, it'll cast it in a different direction.
Yeah. So one of the other kind of staging problems they had was wind, right? The moon supposedly has no atmosphere, and they're planting a flag, and the flag is waving. The way that the flag is constructed, as anyone can see, is it has a pole that comes up from the ground, and then a crossbar that supports the flag on the top. But then the other two sides are unsupported, so they're left to wave freely. And it looks from the video like there's some atmosphere, from the wind or whatever is blowing around. And in your movie, you attributed that to air conditioning. Is that right?
Yeah, there's one great instance where someone just walks past the flag and then it flutters. The excuse of deniers say, well, their hand was on the pole and it's inertia or something like that. It doesn't, like the corner of the flag, blow like in the wind. And there's one instance where no one is even touching the flag. An astronaut comes within a foot of it, and because he's in an atmosphere, the breeze from him going by makes the flag move. I mean, there's all sorts of proofs that they didn't go to the moon. We uncovered classified footage of them faking being halfway to the moon right in front of your eyes with the 1 foot model of the Earth. And it says at the beginning of the tape, do not show to the public. And they're faking being halfway to the moon right in front of your eyes. This is in my film. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon. We discovered this by accident, or either a whistleblower sent it to us. I was producing the film under the theory it might be true that they faked the moon missions. I pop in a tape. It says, do not show to the public. I hit fast forward, and I see the same shot for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. It's like a little blue Earth with black around it, and that's supposed to be the Earth floating in space, looking back at it as they're halfway to the moon. The lights come up, and you see it's a 1 foot model that they use of a circular window with rear projection from Earth orbit shine coming through. And you even hear the CIA telling them not to answer NASA's communications immediately because it'll give away the fact that you're still in Earth orbit close to the Earth. They make them count off 4 seconds, and then they say talk to prompt them after this fake radio delay. It's really incredible. We catch them, and even my greatest critic admits that this is them faking being halfway to the moon. They admit it because it's what they're doing. And he says, well, but they're just rehearsing for the upcoming transmission. Well, first of all, they used the same clip in every documentary that NASA put out of Apollo 11 as a shot of being halfway to the moon, when in fact they're clearly still in Earth orbit 2 days in the flight. Plus, it being dated 2 days in the flight, and the guy acknowledging they're still in Earth orbit, that puts them 2 days behind schedule to walk on the moon on July 20th. And then thirdly, if you're really, shooting the Earth floating in space, you would just rehearse with the Earth floating in space. You wouldn't have to build a model of the Earth if the real Earth was out the window. If you wanted to rehearse before the television, you just rehearse with the real shot, So they're caught lying multiple times. They're creating this forgery. And in my follow-up film, Astronauts Gone Wild, which you can also see for free at Sibrel.com, I show this footage to Buzz Aldrin, who was the one who photographed it. He gets very mad. He says, who gave this to you? And he says, oh, you must want to be, an ego maniac for wanting to become famous for having discovered this footage. And if it means nothing, then how could I become famous, right? So he's admitting that it proves we didn't go to the moon then. And then he says, oh, talk to NASA. We were just passengers. I thought they piloted to the surface. But in fact, they were just passengers in Earth orbit for 8 days. And so here we are 50 years later, and they still can't leave Earth orbit because by faking being halfway to the moon, it proves they can't go halfway. Otherwise, we'd be seeing real footage of it. They can't leave Earth orbit. It's because of the radiation belt most people don't even know about, which doesn't start until about 1,000 miles above the Earth, and it's 30,000 miles thick. So every manned mission from Russia to China to America has been well below 700 miles below the beginning of the radiation, except going to the moon. They'd have to go through it. And remember, we have Kelly Smith, NASA's employee, saying the technology to go through the radiation belt and survive has yet to be invented. So that means they didn't go to the moon, is what it means. It's really remarkable. And we have other astronauts who are in the space station, and they say, someday, eventually, we'll go to the moon. And then when Bush Jr. was president, he said the reason we're going to, quote, return to the moon is because going to the moon is a logical first step to Mars and beyond. Well, we already did it 6 times. How can the 7th time be a first step? Unless there weren't 6 times, right? So, and then Clinton, in his memoir called My Life, on page 156, admits that he thinks that the moon landings were fraudulent. Isn't that interesting?
Wow.
Then we have the story of Carter calling up Bush Sr., who was CIA director at the time, saying, send me everything you got on UFOs. And the CIA director tells the president, I'm not going to do that. So who's running the show, the president or the CIA?
Yeah, we've done a lot of explorations of those types of questions and trying to understand who's really at the helm. And we've come across a lot of examples where government, in institutional government or career government, is pulling the strings of the puppet politicians who, are elected by the voice of the people or the will of the people, and in many cases they are nothing more than a figurehead.
Well, yeah, I mean, did Congress and the Senate vote to fake the moon landings? I mean, that's a pretty important thing to decide on, right?
Right.
Faking the moon landing, I think that's pretty significant. So Congress and Senate should vote on such a thing, right? No, they never voted on it. So that means the people running the country are not our elected officials. How about that? You have 90% of the public demands that we have a label on food that contains genetically modified organisms. And Congress passes it, and the president vetoes it. I thought we lived in a democracy. I mean, when have 90% of Americans agreed on anything? So 90% of Americans want to know what's in the food that they swallow. And the president says, no, I'm not going to tell you that. So who is he representing? The corporations who make GMOs. So I thought this was a democracy, and we have representatives representing the majority. The majority wanted GMO labeling, and the president said no. He did what the corporations wanted him to do, which is the vast minority. So we don't have a democracy. A democracy is as real as the moon landings.
Yes.
We definitely are feeling that more and more with each passing day. It seems like the power and the voice of the people are being just ignored or stifled to a greater and greater extent with each passing day. So when you set about putting together this information, there were a lot of times that you attempted to or were able to interview the astronauts themselves. One of those interactions we alluded to earlier was with Buzz Aldrin, and you talked to him, I think, at least twice, right?
Well, more than I spoke with him on about 4 different occasions, 2 of
Okay.
them on camera.
And one of them led to him punching you because he was upset about what you said. Now, can you walk us through that interaction?
Well, I was the guest of a Japanese television program that was interviewing him and had their own personal suspicions that he was a liar. I had been in Japan, I think, once or twice before at that time, uh, giving book interviews. There was a Japanese book written about the fake moon landings. I did television interviews about it. I did a lecture on it there. The Japanese are very smart people. They're very good engineers, and they know that we didn't go to the moon. And other nations know about it too, and simply don't say it for, I guess, for mutual blackmail or something like that. And so I was their surprise guest. And after the first film came out, a funny thing happened on the way to the moon. I guess from watching childhood court dramas where people swear on the Bible that they're telling the truth, I thought, hey, why not just track down some Apollo astronauts and ask them to swear on the Bible? The only 2 who did it were the avowed atheists, and the ones that refused acknowledged they had a belief in a divine creator and a judgment to come, so they wouldn't take that chance. I mean, we have to realize how odd it is that when President Bush Jr., who was president during 9/11, right? And which is kind of weird that he would show up at the ground zero. Remember that shot with the firemen, and everyone's applauding him for failing, for killing 3,000 people on his watch, right? I mean, if a security guard was at a bank or at a, let's say, a daycare center and fell asleep and 3,000 kids were killed, would he go back there a week later and be applauded? I mean, what's going on with our media that brainwashes that a guy who was responsible for the safety and security of our nation failed, and he shows up at the place where his failure caused the death of 3,000 people, and people applaud him? Okay. Well, anyway, when that guy and his vice president, who was probably really the president, are asked to testify before the 9/11 hearings, they say, we'll be glad to do so as long as we're not required to testify under oath. What? They will tell you whatever they want to tell you about 9/11 as long as they don't have to pledge that they're telling the truth.
Right.
And Congress lets them get away with that? I mean, that's an admission that they're lying. I mean,
Yeah.
it boggles
right
the
there.
mind.
Yeah, it's an admission of their intention to deceive. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
And
I saw an interview with Bush Sr. 10, 20 years after he was president. And I'm watching him very suspiciously, a CIA director, and I suspect he had something to do with Kennedy's assassination, the moon landing, and who knows what else. And I'm watching him during the interview, and it just astonished me. He didn't appear to ever lie. And I think that's what certain, you could say, squirrely people do. They try not to get caught in a lie, at least on camera. He was very careful semantically with what he said and how he said it, so that technically he would not be telling a lie. And that's pretty interesting from a former CIA director, right? And
right.
it's so odd when we have in Russia a former KGB officer becoming, president of Russia, and then a former CIA director becoming president of the United States, and then a Jesuit, which is the CIA of the Vatican, becoming Pope, all around the same time. It's not a good sign.
No.
Yeah. So you're on this Japanese program, and were they trying to like ambush Buzz Aldrin? Is that what was going on?
I don't think that's too strong of a word. It's just, look, if a guy is guilty of murder, right, and got away with it, coming up to him with a camera and a microphone saying, well, what do you have to say for yourself? Is that ambushing? No, it's the other way around. And if the guy just embezzled $200 billion and is a traitor to the country, and he hasn't gone to trial yet, and he's getting away with it every day, making millions of dollars, I think he has a right to be confronted with journalists who know the truth. It's not an ambush. He ambushed us, right? He ambushed us, took a third of our labor to fake the moon landings, and then the government killed people who tried to expose it with our tax dollars. They hired staff, the assassins, the equipment to murder people who are whistleblowers. We pay for that and our deception. How about that? So I don't consider it an ambush. I consider it a valid surprise guest or whatever. I remember covering some election, presidential election in the past as a reporter for NBC. And I asked one of the candidates running for president of the United States a question. And they said, no questions are allowed. And literally, they sent the Secret Service to rebuke me as a journalist for asking a presidential candidate a question because no one was supposed to ask them any questions. That's our country. How about that? I went to NASA and I had credentials. I was on the journalist list, and I just asked one or two Apollo astronauts to swear on the Bible that they walked on the moon. I was kicked out. You would have thought I was in North Korea or China. That you can't ask a serious question, a real question. If you believe the lies and promote the lies, you're perfectly fine and welcome in the club. And if you try to expose their fraud, then they treat you like you're in a communist country. It boggles the mind, all the censorship going on, and no one in Congress or the Senate is contesting it. There's supposed to be freedom of the press. And if YouTube is a neutral publishing platform or Google, and I can say whatever I want as a journalist, I can say I think this is real or this is fake, but you can't do that. That's obstruction of freedom of the press. It's been going on for years. No one seems to care anything about it.
Well, I don't think the answer to that, I don't think no one cares. I think there's a lot of people who do care. But I think they find themselves in the same place where you did, which is that they're being shut down, they're being turned away, they're being silenced on these supposedly neutral platforms.
Yeah, I mean, our country is so far from what our founding fathers, set up. It boggles the mind that it's not a democracy; it's a dictatorship, and it's a corrupt dictatorship. And I have a contact in China, and I said, well, what's it like there? And this guy's working high up in the Chinese government doing advanced things, and he says, for one, NASA is selling China a bunch of secrets. They're selling them. That's illegal right there. And then he says, they may not have free speech or whatever as much as we allegedly have here. There's no homelessness. There's no homeless people anywhere. The government finds housing for everybody. Here, homelessness just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. Every corner, there's homeless people asking for money. And yet in China, there's no homeless people. What's going on here? Right?
Yeah, I don't know much about China, so I can't really comment there. But yeah, that is an interesting question. Now, as far as your continued efforts beyond the first Apollo missions, what are your thoughts about these kind of private space exploration companies like SpaceX and Amazon? Are they doing anything new, or is it more of the same? Are they going to end up faking a mission to Mars, faking a mission to the moon?
Well, I think those are billionaires' toys to go into suborbital flight to have a nice view of the Earth and say, "Hey, I experienced zero gravity for a couple of minutes." I think that's all that's about. They can't go to the moon, so how could they possibly go to Mars? I mean,
Right.
come on. Mars is 55 million miles away. That's about 200 times farther than the moon is. And the fuel and the time and all that's a dream. We haven't even gone to the moon yet. So how can we possibly go to Mars? Now, I suspect that Elon Musk knows that we did not go to the moon. In fact, I know he has a copy of my book, and he wants to go into orbit himself or whatever he wants to do, and he needs NASA's cooperation to do that. So he's just keeping his mouth shut about certain things. You can't really blame him for that. I think there's probably some cosmic event heading our way. a comet, an asteroid, rogue planet, or something. And when that all hits the fan, and that's probably why they're doing this little scenario for the last 2 years to help lower the number of people on Earth before the shock of this natural event doing it for them too quickly. I think they're preparing for that. Janet Napolitano said the day she resigned, just like Eisenhower's farewell warning, she said a natural disaster is coming that's never happened in America before. Well, there's a third clue. It's a natural disaster. Somehow you can know about years in advance. So we've had earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes. You can't predict those years in advance. The only thing that's natural that you can know about years in advance that never happened in America is a comet or an asteroid, something like that. And there's one making a very close approach on April 13th, 2029, that I believe is going to hit the Earth. It's going to come below the communication satellites, and they're probably just going to let it happen as part of their lowering the population agenda and blame it on Mother Nature.
It's not named Wormwood by any chance, is it?
No, that's a nickname. This one's called Apophis. Apparently, in the book of Revelation, it seems like there's two notable asteroids that hit the Earth. Jesus also talked about the stars falling from the sky like ripe figs. I think that's a meteor storm. And then Isaiah 13 says, of the last days, the earth will be moved out of its place. I think that means out of orbit. And most people don't know, prior to 705 BC, every calendar civilization of the world had the Earth's year at 360 days. That's why there's 360 degrees on a compass. And something happened in 705 BC because immediately after, everyone changed to 365 and a quarter. What that means is the Earth was pulled further away from the sun, slightly. That took another 5 days to go around. What could pull the Earth further away from the sun? Something much larger than the Earth. And so if Isaiah 13:13 says in the last days, the Earth will be moved out of its place, out of its orbit, then potentially this rogue planet that came by in 705 BC is going to come around again. And if you believe in God, God will use these clockwork organisms that he set in place to bring about the end time tribulation on the earth. And I think that's what Janet Napolitano was warning people about.
Okay.
So you're saying they already know it's coming, and they're just
absolutely.
They're just keeping it under wraps. They're not going to.
Why would they tell us? They're lying to us about everything. You really think they're going to tell us a comet's coming toward the Earth? Of course not. No. You know?
No, I don't think they would.
Yeah, I mean, the Vatican actually owns the most powerful telescope in the world. It's a binocular 3D telescope and an infrared telescope. So rogue planets can likely not be seen by optical telescopes. You need an infrared telescope. So they happen to have a telescope in Arizona, oddly named the Lucifer telescope. And someone of their Jesuit set, because Jesuits run the telescope, he said on his deathbed that they're tracking an object with the Lucifer telescope that's going to play a significant part in human history in the last days. Well, I think they're tracking object Lucifer, the rogue planet, rogue, rebellious Lucifer, rogue Lucifer, you see? And there's all these scientific journals coming out now. They're saying basically for every solar system in the galaxy, there's probably 2 rogue planets. And if they're captured by a star, they have this comet-like orbit. And in 1045 AD, according to Gil Broussard of planet7x.net, there was a Chinese observation, an astronomer who saw a, quote, red dragon in the sky, which he believes was passing a planet X. And so sometimes it's on the other side of the sun and we don't see it. And sometimes we do, and it's not close. And sometimes it may come very close. It could very well be what brings the end times tribulation. Because Jesus said not only would there be an increase in earthquakes, which a rogue planet would cause, Not only would there be meteor storms, which Jesus spoke of, he also says that men's hearts are melting with fear because of what is coming upon the earth, including signs in the heavens. And then he also says one of the signs is the tossing and turning of the seas. Well, the moon is about 1/4 the size of the Earth, and it causes somewhat tossing and turning of the seas, about a 20-foot tidal effect every day. So, if planet X is 7 times bigger than the Earth, that's about 30 times bigger than the moon. Imagine the tossing and turning of the seas that
Mhm.
Jesus might have warned us about.
Yeah, I could see it with that huge planet, the rogue planet. I mean, we'd probably say goodbye to California with waves.
Well, yeah, and the asteroid that the gentleman saw uh, hit the ocean off the coast of San Diego and caused a tidal wave in his vision a couple of 100 miles in on the southwestern United States. So he was even told the name of the rock in this vision called Apophis, and that's the one that's coming, on April 13th, 2029. So we've got a lot of indications that things like this are happening, and that's probably why the people who run the world are trying to lower the number of people in an incremental way, so that when a solar wide system event happens, it'll be less of a shock on society because people will already been trimmed down.
That is
Man,
dark.
Well, yeah, you can
So
go to
dark.
my website, Sibrel.com, scroll down. I wrote an article, took me hundreds of hours to research and write with multiple links in it, called Is Planet X God's End Time Tribulation? A very detailed article, and another one beneath that about aliens, whether they're real or a potential deception. Go into great detail about that. Hundreds of hours of research and multiple links to back up the assertions in the article. They're all at Sibrel.com.
All right, so let's go ahead and share that website. I'm going to pull that up just real quick.
that's crazy. That I didn't even. I live in Arizona, and I didn't even know that there was a Lucifer telescope here.
Yeah, you should drive to it. Light a candle.
It's on Mount Graham, which is in eastern Arizona, and it's a very well-known mountain here. But all right, so we're looking at
I think there's
Sibrel.com.
some goats on that mountain too.
Oh
Some
yeah.
Billy goats on Billy Graham Mountain. It's a sign.
It is a popular camping destination, and there are school excursions to that telescope. But here we are at Sibrel.com. You can find the link to the Moon Man book.
Yeah, I have it in 3 formats, actually technically 4. There's an autographed hard copy. There's the regular, paperback you can get for $20. There's the audiobook, which I read myself, and then there's a Kindle version. So you can get digital, audio, print, or print autographed.
Very nice. And then the articles right here we have: Is Planet X God's End Times Tribulation?
Yeah, and if you scroll all the way down to the very bottom, you'll see I just released, go above that, just above that image, to the Game of 7. My friend John Himes and we just released a board game. I knew that chess and checkers were 8x8, so we designed a board game that's 7x7 with 7 pieces each that have to move 7 spaces every turn. The game is called 7. It's a free download, and it's completely cross-platform. You can play it on your iPhone, Android phone, Windows desktop, Mac desktop, on Steam, and any combination. You can play iPhone to Windows, Android phone to Mac, back and forth, and it just came out. And it's a free download, and it's a really cool game. You can play the AI, or you can play anybody in the world. There's, like I said, it's a 7x7 board, and you can, play. I guess the average game is about 15 minutes. It's a little bit more difficult than checkers, but a lot less complicated than chess. and you can give it a try. And it's a pretty game. In fact, I'll do a quick screen share if you want. Let me see here if I can do it. Share screen. Share screen. I'll share this one. Let me go to launching the game here. So that's our logo. I'm going to play the AI. I'm going to choose my favorite board. I'm on there's 7 levels. There's 1 archangel on the first level, 2 archangels on the second level, and so forth. They have special powers. So here's the archangel with the halo. If any of the 2 dice or all 3 add up to 7, you can choose any of the dice and you get to go again. So the red indicates which ones add up to 7. I can choose any of them. If you click on here, I'm going to take the 3. So I move a 3 one direction, a 90-degree turn, and it has to total 7. So there's my turn. Now, the object of the game is to get 4 of your pieces simultaneously on all 4 of these swirling clouds called the gates of heaven before your opponent does. The center square is called the throne of God. You can't pass through it. If you're knocked off of a gate of heaven, you go to one of these Sheol squares. These squares here are red because it is from a red square that you can capture a gate of heaven. Not a rule, it just works out that way mathematically. And I'm going to go ahead and take it. And you get another turn every time 2 or all 3 of your dice add up to 7. If you roll 666, you lose the game. So I'm going to go ahead and move here. Yeah, and I actually did the voiceover of the devil. It sounds like with a little cartoon face. And it has sound effects. You can hear them a little bit. There's also a pretty nice music track. I don't play it because I like to concentrate, but let's see. Here's the music. Kind of Gregorian chants. And I'll turn up these sound effects too so you can hear it better.
Boy, I like that.
So there you go. That gives you an idea.
All right.
I'll go ahead and quit the game. Voila. So there you go.
Well, Bart, it has been a total adventure. So for everybody who's tuning in and watching and listening, make sure that you check out Sibrel.com. The movie is Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. The book is Moon Man. There's another movie. What's the name of the other movie, Bart?
A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon and Astronauts Gone Wild. Were you able to see the board a minute ago?
We didn't get to see the board. I had the website up, though.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I must have forgot to hit the share button. After all that time of looking at it for 2 minutes. Oh, well. I'll try to do better next time. I got too many screens and buttons going on at the same time.
Not a problem. We appreciate you coming on the show. Make sure, for all our viewers, make sure you like, comment, subscribe. We definitely want to know what you think about the information that Bart shared with us today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to let us know, and we will try and get you the answers as quickly as we can.
I'm going to go out on the
here it is.
Game. This time I can show it to you. I'll be able to share it now this time. So I was describing something you couldn't see. It'd be good for radio. So I'll just show you the board really quick. And there it is.
Oh, okay. There we go. That makes a lot more sense.
Those are the archangels there that I was speaking of. And that's how you kind of play. These are the gates of heaven that you capture to win the game. And there's your opponent. If you hit click here, I'll move a 1. It always totals 7. It was a 90, one direction, a 90-degree turn, and then the other way. So there you go. So free download at Sibrel.com at the bottom of the page.
Awesome.
Excellent.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you so
for coming
much.
on.
And thanks to everybody in our chat. We appreciate you tuning in live and sharing your thoughts. And until next time, keep on exploring the edges of the unknown.